Cool. So everyone that's joined us, my name's Dee, and Tamzin is going to be doing the, oh, sorry, I have to consent to the recording. Is going to be doing the presentation for us today, and I'm sort of going to try to moderate and sort of, if you guys have any questions in that, please feel free to ask them throughout. Please mute your microphones as well. That would be great.
No, I'm just watching something. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just mute the people that.
Okay, brilliant.
Okay, I think we're ready to go. Okay,
great. So hi everyone, I'm Tamzin Furtado, and I've been studying equine obesity for the last nearly 4 years now, and in that time I've been really lucky to make good friends with and work with Dr Pollard, who's also studying equine weight management and laminitis management and so on. So we formed this kind of fat pony fighting team, and we are planning to do lots of events in the coming weeks, and we've got some speakers, really amazing speakers lined up, like Clare MacLeod, who started with us today to talk with us today, which we're really excited about. So we thought we'd start off this first webinar by talking about body condition scoring, which is one of those things I was thinking, a good way of thinking about body condition scoring is, as horse riders, people, when you tell people you horse ride, and people always say, oh, I can ride, and they say, like, oh yeah, I know how to ride, and then you allow them to get on your horse, and they maybe sat on a donkey once, but they think they know how to do it. We've probably all seen that before, and body condition scoring is a little bit like that, because it's one of those things where people often feel like, because it looks quite simple, just like sitting on a horse looks quite simple, at first sight. So people often think, oh yeah, that's really easy, I don't need to think or learn any more about it. And therefore they don't learn any more about it, but actually don't kind of realize how much you need to kind of think about it, and how important it is to put a bit more thought into condition scoring your horse. So because you're here today, you're probably much more interested in condition scoring than maybe the majority of the equine population. So that's absolutely fantastic. So you're clearly really interested in keeping your horses healthy and so on. So what we're going to do is to go through condition scoring a range of different horses. We've got 5 different case studies, owners who very kindly shared their photos, to help you to work out then how to condition score with your own horses. So just a very brief introduction. So obviously we're going to be mainly talking about condition scoring in relation to overweight today, and it's probably no surprise to you guys if you're here to just hear some of the kind of stats and information about obesity in our leisure horses in the UK. So we think that up to around 60% of our leisure horses are obese, and of course that means that they are at increased risk of lots of different issues, including obviously laminitis, but also osteoarthritis, soft tissue injuries, and some types of colic. So we often hear of horses who have lost 100 kilograms in a weight management program, and you think of a horse carrying around its rider as well as an extra 100 kilograms, so that's really like carrying 2 riders, and then think about the effect that that's going to be having on its soft tissue and on its skeletal structures and so on. So obesity can have a really big impact on how the horse can actually function long term. And the frustrating thing is that it's totally curable if we realise it early enough, but often that doesn't happen. And one of the reasons that doesn't happen is that in our society, we have this kind of idea that fat animals are quite funny. So we often see memes, for example, being shared, like this one: the farrier said no more treats, so I ate him. And that's seen as kind of funny, and like it's okay to laugh at it and share it and so on. But it's very unlikely that you would ever see memes being shared about a horse that looks like this. So, if you imagine these 2 ponies on your yard and think about how people would react to the 2 of them, it's quite likely that this horse, this very thin horse here, would be really quite a concern for people, whereas the fat pony, people might say, oh yeah, it's really fat, but it's very unlikely that it would be treated with quite the same urgency. And we're focusing on condition scoring with the upper end of the scale, because at this bottom end of the scale, like the bay horse here, people don't have too much trouble usually knowing that that horse is underweight and what to do about it. But the upper end of the scale causes huge amounts of problems in identifying what's actually fat on the horse in comparison to what's muscle and in comparison to what's just the horse's shape. Whereas, of course, at the bottom end of the scale, that's not such a big deal, because you can very easily see the skeleton and any muscle that the horse still has. So in terms of measuring weight and what body condition scoring actually is, so body condition scoring is the only way of assessing the amount of fat on the horse in a kind of practical way. So there are some veterinary things you can do, but they're not very practical on the yard. So body condition scoring is the only way where you can actually see what's actual fat and what's muscle and what's the horse's shape. So other things that people might do to measure the weight of a horse include putting the horse on a weigh bridge, using a weigh tape, or using a calculation to see how much the horse probably weighs. And those are all really, really helpful tools. But the thing is that they don't tell you anything. Just as if you weigh, so for example, we've got two 14-3 Arabs on our yard, and we could put them both on a weighing scale, and they might be 30 kilograms different. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell us whether those two Arabs, one of them's 30 kilograms overweight. Just because they're both Arabs and they're the same height doesn't mean they have the same build, because they're differently, they have slightly different body types. So that number that you would get from a weighing scale is very useful to see if your horse is gaining weight or losing weight. It's the same with a weigh tape, for example, or a calculation. But we do need a measure of being able to look at the horse and say, how fat is it? And that's what body condition scoring allows us to do. So I always say about body condition scoring, one of the interesting things about it is that in absolutely everything else to do with your horse, then we would say that you are the expert on your horse, and you can judge best because you're the one who knows your horse really well. But there are two problems with horse ownership, or any animal ownership actually, which means that unfortunately with condition scoring it doesn't work like that. And so it's a really good idea to have training like you're in today, which helps you to be more objective, but also to work with your trusted friends, and also your farrier, your vet, and so on, your instructor, any professionals coming to see your horse. And the reason for that is twofold. Firstly, because you love your horse. I'm assuming everybody here is probably here because they love their horse and they want the best for it. And secondly, because you are very likely to see your horse on an extremely regular basis, probably every day, or at least several times a week for most people. Some people will see their horse numerous times a day. And both of those things together are a really potent combination, which means it's very, very hard to be objective about weight. So there have been lots of studies looking at how people think about the weight of their animals, and owners nearly always underestimate the condition of their animals. They get better as they have training, which is fantastic, but it's always best to have a professional as well as a more objective person, because just because you love your animal, it's hard to be objective about them. But also because of that familiarity, it's really hard to see when they're gaining and losing if you see them every day. Whereas someone like your farrier, for example, or your trimmer, seeing your horse every 6 weeks, perhaps, is a perfect amount of time to be able to judge whether the horse is gaining or losing. So fantastic that you're here today, and hopefully this will give you the tools to be able to look at your horse objectively, but always we totally recommend always asking for help as well from any professional that you have coming to see your horse. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in my study I was looking at how people focus on different areas of the body and what people look at in order to tell whether a horse is fat. And what we found, and rightly so, is that owners often focus on the crest, whether there's an apple bottom, the girth area, but worryingly, the most thing that people talked about was the abdominal area or belly. And the reason that that's worrying is that just like us, horses, the belly area where the arrow's pointing there can increase or decrease absolutely drastically depending on a load of factors that aren't to do with fat. So, you know, if you've been on the beer or you've perhaps had, you know, quite a lot of white bread or whatever, you may find that you're quite bloated. if you go to some sort of exercise class which makes you work your core, you might be in pain, but you also might find that you feel like, oh, I feel, you know, so svelte, I've got some real stomach muscles coming in. And it's exactly the same with our horses. So, you know, we've all seen your horse coming in off the grass, you know, suddenly looks like a kind of hippo. You know, you might see a belly that sticks out. That's not a good judge of whether the horse is actually fat or not, because you could have the same horse, you know, really built up its core muscles and so on, and it won't look so fat, but actually the horse could still be really fat overall. Or the opposite, the horse actually isn't very fat, but it's got a bloated belly for whatever reason. So the trouble with the way that most horse owners that say they condition score is that people just kind of have an overall look at the horse, so what we call an eyeball. So they might look at this horse here and go, yeah, not too bad, can see a bit of an apple bum, you know, maybe a little bit fat, but, you know, fine. So they're not breaking the horse down into different sections, and that's what's really important about condition scoring, that we think about the horse more carefully, break it down into these different sections and look at each section objectively and in a different way from the others. So just before we look at our case study horses, I just wanted to have a little talk about crests, because they're particularly interesting, and we do actually have a case study with an interesting crest to talk about, which is lovely. So this is a picture from a horse feed website, I'm afraid to say. Now, crests are really confusing to a lot of owners, because obviously there's something that in a horse that's fit and working well, we like to see a crest. And, you know, I mean, you look at any statue of, you know, war heroes with their nice beautiful horses and so on, Napoleon and whoever, and you know, these horses have got this really nice bulky neck, but it can be quite hard to tell whether that comes from fat or whether it comes from muscle. Now this horse here, we can see that this is definitely just a fat crest, because you can actually see the bulk of the neck. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving, and the rest of it is kind of flopping over to the side there. Now that is completely nothing. There's no muscle there. There's no muscle above what we call the nuchal ligament, which is a ligament that runs along the top of the neck. You can find your own nuchal ligament to practice finding on the horse. So if you tip your head forwards and then feel down the back of your neck, there's some feels almost like kind of ropes, and that's what horses have down their neck as well, along the top. And above that nuchal ligament, which on this horse would be at the top of, you can see his withers, so it would be running sort of here to this point on the poll where you can see it starting off. Above that there is nothing that can be other than fat. So if you were to do a post-mortem on this horse and you were to cut that open, it would literally be like a whale amount of fat. And so we can see this again on this Welsh cob here. So again, I'm just going to, with my mouse, I'm going to follow. So you can see at the top of this horse's neck, this is where his poll would be. I think this is a stallion. We're going to talk more about stallion crests. So this is slightly more allowed than if it was, say, a mare. But you can see here, so this horse's neck, if it didn't have this crest, would follow the line down, probably around here to where its nuchal ligament is. And so again, all of this is just fat. And a useful way of thinking of it is that usually if it's a fatty crest, you can imagine the neck just without that on. So you could probably imagine this horse with a much weedier neck, and you could imagine that actually would be its neck, and you could just remove the whole thing. In comparison, this is a horse, a very fit dressage PRE stallion who is working at a high level of dressage. And if you look at this horse's crest, can you imagine removing any, that it would be possible to just remove or kind of cut off any of that? Because actually this horse's neck, so again, there is a slight crest there. So in fact, it's slightly nicely highlighted in this white. So his nuchal ligament is probably on that shiny bit there. So he's got maybe an inch or two there, which is where his plaits are nicely sitting. But again, there's very little that you could kind of take off the top of his neck. So that's a really helpful way of thinking about whether it's fat or muscle. And it's worth saying that to get a horse to have a nice neck like this, which is rounded and that comes from muscle as opposed to from fat, the horse would have to be in a very high level of work. So like this horse, he's does a lot of cross training, he's working at a very high level of dressage. So people often think or are a bit confused by whether their horse's crest is muscle or fat. So a good place to start is how hard is your horse working and how does it work? Is it, you know, really using its neck? And then looking again at whether you could imagine kind of almost just removing, so this horse, you could imagine kind of stripping that off his neck. So that's just a bit about crests before we start, because they're quite interesting. So with condition scoring, we're going to be using the 0 to 5 condition scoring chart. So there are 2 charts, so you might see that there's a 1 to 9 one and a 0 to 5, which we're using here. It doesn't really matter which one you use. The consensus now is that it's kind of better to stick with the 0 to 5 one, so that's what's used by most of the charities and most vets, for example. It's fine if you want to use the other one, that's absolutely fine. They work kind of the same. And the idea is that what they help you to do is quite simply is to split the horse down into the pelvis, the midsection, so that's behind the shoulder up to the hindquarters, and the neck area. And if we look at each section of the horse separately, then it helps us to break down and see where that fat actually is. And obviously 5 here, we've got a very fat horse, so it would have a deep gutter to the root of the tail, pelvis buried, can't be felt, you can't feel the ribs, and a marked crest which is wide and firm, right down to 0, which is very, very poor. Most of us have hopefully not really seen horses looking like this, because it would be, I mean, incredibly rare in the UK. Even for our welfare cases, they don't usually go that low. So you'd have a
Sorry, Tamzin, we just lost you there for a little bit.
Sorry.
If you could just repeat your last sentence, maybe.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying, so 0, very poor. Most of us wouldn't really have seen horses like this, because even in the UK, even our RSPCA cases and so on don't usually get quite this low. So that would be looking at a horse that looks really very much like a skeleton. So if you follow, for example, the PFK charity in Egypt, which a lot of people do, you'll often see horses that are in this state, but obviously not very common for us here. We're normally at the 3 to 5 end of the scale, which is what we're going to be focusing on today. So these are our 5 case studies today, and Dee is just going to tell us a little bit about each of them. While she's talking, just have a little look at them and maybe note down, if you've got a notepad or anything there, your initial impressions of each horse and which ones you think are particularly fat and which ones you think are okay, if any, and what you think. And also just have a think about which ones are most like the body type of your horse, because we've got quite different horses here. Okay, so over to Dee.
Cool, thanks very much. Yeah, so we have a nice sort of spread of shapes and sizes. 4 out of 5 are mares, so the girls are representing a bit more, and we have 1 gelding. So I'm just going to start in the bottom left with the little bay, and that's a 13-year-old 14 one-hand New Forest mare. She's non-ridden at the moment, but she can be taken out in hand and also as a lead and ride pony. And she lives with the pony on the bottom right corner, which is a Highland mare, and she's 18 years old. She is a little bit of an escape artist, according to her owner, so can be quite difficult to contain sort of in a restricted grazing area. And she's 18, as I already said, she's 18 years old and she's 14-1. And then in the middle, we've got a youngster who is 3 years old and she's 15 hands, traditional mare, and she's going to probably grow a little bit as well. So it'll be quite interesting to kind of talk about weight management for a growing pony a little bit later. In the top left corner, we have our gelding, and he is a 16-year-old 15-2 hand PRE gelding. So he was previously very fit, doing lots of eventing and endurance riding, but has been sort of rehabbing the last 2 years after a series of injuries. So he has changed shape quite a bit. And he's also going to be an interesting one because he was gelded around 8 years old. So it'll be interesting to sort of have a look at his crest as we're going through. And then last but not least, in the top right corner, we have a 9-year-old 14-3 hand mixed breed mare, and she's a rescue. She's non-ridden, and she does have some damage to her wither area from a rearing accident that happened when she was about 4 or 5 years old. So that does make sort of the condition scoring in that area a little bit tricky when we're just looking at it. But I then hand over back to Tamzin, who will take us through each of the cases.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with this lovely pony. So just maybe put in the chat your initial impressions on that 0 to 6 scale. We are going to go through in detail, but maybe just post in the chat your initial impressions of this pony and what you think when you look at her. Sorry, my phone's falling over. Hopefully you haven't lost me. So for me, my initial impressions with her were you know, lovely fit looking pony. We don't often see New Forest ponies looking in this kind of shape. She looks fantastic. And so if I just had to look at this picture of her, I would say, yeah, she was probably right bang in the middle of the scale. And this is one of the things that we kind of wanted to say, is that that's the trouble. If you eyeball, then you often just eyeball and just kind of look at the overall impression, then you often really miss things. So what we've had our owners do is to look at the pony, their pony, and look at a condition scoring video, and then take lots of different pictures for us from different angles, condition score the pony themselves so that they can then give us their own impression of the different areas and so on. And then we've worked with the owners and checked back with them to talk to them about what the condition is. So if we were to just look at the pictures like this and say, oh yeah, it's a 3, then that's not going to be very helpful to the owner. So we've been through a whole process, and just to outline as well, we shouldn't really just condition score from pictures alone. So if anyone asks you for a picture of your pony and then wants to condition score it, they can probably get an impression, but as you'll see today, you can really miss things. So it's quite important to really go through that process.
So Tamzin, we're getting a lot of 3s mostly for this pony from the chat.
Yeah, that's exactly what I would think as well, looking at this picture. So this is why it's such an interesting
couple
pony.
of 1 or 2 4s, but okay. Mostly 3s.
Okay, great. So here, then we can just take a closer look at her neck. Now, interestingly, the owner had said that she thought the pony's neck was a 4. And Dee and I, when we were originally, we had a meeting where we sat down and looked at all these ponies in a bit more detail. And you can see the owner's comment there. She had an obvious thick crest when running the hand down, stops at the shoulder, but there are fat pads there. So if you imagine what we talked about with the nuchal ligament of this pony, it looks like you could imagine, so the top of her poll here, it looks like you could imagine the nuchal ligament here, and it doesn't actually look like there's that much of a crest there. And Dee and I originally said to the owner, we didn't think her neck would be more than a 3.5. And if you look at this picture, so the next thing to do condition scoring once you've looked at the crest area is to run your hand down the neck and see what happens when you get to the shoulder. So how much of a feeling is there because some horses will be like almost all one kind of blob shape. So our owners kindly also took a photo from this direction so that you can imagine what happens here. So Dee and I, our initial impression was a 3.5 because it didn't look like there was too much of a crest there above the nuchal ligaments. It does look like that your hand would come to a bit of a stop here, but we said, you know, we'd like to talk to the owner about how that actually feels in this area. We can see the shoulder on this horse, but not completely obviously. Now, the owner said, this is another interesting point about photographs, that actually her crest is much thicker than it's able to be, that you can see on the photo. So it is thick from the top to the bottom. So although it doesn't look in the photos as much as the grey Highland pony that we'll see in a minute, it definitely is actually thicker, which is interesting, isn't it? So here, so now we can see we've got some fat around the shoulder area. If you imagine running your hands down her actual shoulder here, so you want to be able to feel the skeleton, the top of the shoulder blade, and ideally you want to be able to feel the withers as well and the differentiation between those. So after discussing that with the owner and between us, we decided that from this pony's neck, her neck and shoulder area would be a 4. So you can see that here, we've got slight crest, wide and firm. So not very fat, but on the fat bit of the scale. Then if we look at her middle, so as we all said from the side, she looks, you know, looks cracking there. But the owners description was, there is not a lot of a curve when you place the hand on her back. You can't see or feel the skeleton and struggle to feel her ribs. So what she means about the curve over the back is that what you want to do is, if you imagine that pony's back, you place your hand on flat on her back like that around the midsection. So ideally you go from the withers, put one hand on the withers, then one hand behind it, then put your hand down. Now your hand should come off on some sort of curve on really nearly every type of conformation. I guess there will be some that are just naturally going to have a flatter back, but really there should always be some differentiation there. Now if you imagine this pony's back, you can see that it would be really quite flat, and you can also see that the withers just kind of disappear into the back, so there's no clear kind of withers there in comparison to some of the others that we'll see. And as the owner said, you would struggle to feel her ribs, so it's quite hard to feel her ribs. So then we need to look at the scale. So a 4 would be ribs well covered, you need pressure to feel them. A 5 would be ribs buried and cannot be felt. And a 3 would be ribs just covered and easily felt. So because her ribs are hard to feel and her back is flat, we've given her a 4.5 here, because as you can see, there's not very much differentiation along the top of her back. The owners, talked us through how it's really quite hard to feel her ribs. And you can't see or feel her skeleton generally. So then if we move on to her hindquarters, so the owner's assessment is that I can feel the skeleton around the hip, but again, there are fat pads also around the top of the tailbone. So looking on the left-hand side of the condition scoring of the hindquarters here, so we need to think about what this means for this pony. So a 3 would mean that she was covered by fat and rounded, there would be no gutter, and it would be very easy to feel her pelvis. So the pelvis is the skeleton under there, so you should be able to feel the point of the hip. You should be able to feel that there are kind of bones going down here. And on a 4, the pelvis would be covered by fat, and you'd need firm pressure to feel it, and there would be a gutter to root of the tail. A 5, very fat, would be deep gutter to root of the tail, skin distended, pelvis buried and cannot be felt. So looking at this pony's hindquarters, so you can see that there is a bit of a gutter. There's some kind of dimples here. Dimples are usually a sign of some fat. There's a bit of a gutter, although it's quite hard to see whether that's her dorsal stripe. She's got a bit of a dorsal stripe, and there are some fat pads around the side here, but could definitely be worse. So we gave her hindquarters a 4. So this gives her a 4 overall. So we had a 4 for her neck, 4.5 for her midsection, and a 4 for her hindquarters. So that just kind of goes to show how, looking at the picture from the side on, you get a really different point of view to when you actually look in more depth at what's actually going on for that pony. So we'd say she was a 4 overall. So we'll just move on to number 2. So here we've got our PRE. So again, just looking at him, so maybe just pop in the chat and tell me what you think about him overall. So he's probably not going to be a 0 or a 1 or a 2. So 3, 4, or 5 for this lovely boy.
Okay, we have 1, 3, 3.5, a 4, a 4.5. So we have quite a big range of kind of from 3 to 4.5.
Yeah, which is totally understandable, because again, an interesting one, and this is where it gets so, I think Dee and I are proper geeks about this because we love doing this kind of thing, but this is where it really takes, so even though we do this all the time, we still had to have a meeting together and sit down and look at each bit of each horse individually. So that's how important it is to always use the scale.
Oh, definitely. And always, I think, just to mention, always refer to a chart or something. Like we watched the video by Teresa Hollands on body condition scoring just before we did it, just to remind ourselves, because even though if you do it a lot, it's always good to kind of go back and kind of reset yourself and then go for it again.
And especially because every horse is so different, which is kind of what we're going to be covering here with these 5 really different types of horses. So you can see with this guy, as a PRE, he's got that big neck. He was a stallion for a while, which we talked about, but he looks quite a nice shape overall. We can see a bit of fat dimpling. So we've got some interesting things going on here. So just starting with his neck, did I have an owner? Sorry, I've spoiled the surprise now. So we talked about his neck. Now, on this photo, it doesn't look like it's a massive crest, but his owner sent us some videos of herself actually videoing as she scored him, and you can see her hand actually covering his crest. So he's got about that much, so probably a hand's much of crest on there. Now, in condition scoring, technically you're supposed to ignore a crest on a stallion, and this horse was a stallion until he was 8 or 9. However, that area is actually fat if it's kind of wobbling like that, and not like the black stallion that we saw in the picture before. So we did actually check in with one of the vets who is kind of one of the top vets in the country for looking at this kind of thing, see what she thought. She said we can probably allow that on a stallion because you wouldn't really get rid of it ever, but to note that it is just fat. So if it was to go hard, you'd need to keep a lot more of an eye on a stallion or a gelding who still has that stallion crest than you would on other horses, because if that starts to go hard or it grows a lot more, that's where the fat's going to go straight there. And a lot of people will be like, oh wow, he looks fantastic because of the crest, because that's what we expect to see on a stallion. But at the same time, we have to remember that it is fat that's under there. So looking at his neck, we are going to, because it's really floppy, we are going to allow that crest and not worry too much about it. And as his owner said, and you can imagine, you can actually see some nice differentiation in his neck here around, you know, you can see some shadow and so on. And if you imagine running your hand down his shoulder, you can see that it would stop quite clearly at the shoulder here. And you can also see some nice differentiation between his shoulder blade and his withers here. So we've said, if you look at the condition scoring for the neck, slight crest, wide and firm, but allowing for the fact that there is some fat there and also behind the shoulder here. So we've said that he is a 4, as I already spoiled the surprise. Then if we look at his midsection, so his owner said here that actually it was you could feel his ribs, but it was really quite hard, so she had to like really dig in to feel his ribs. However, when she put her hand on the flat of his back, as I showed you before, it did come off in a curve. So that's quite interesting, because that means that all the fat he's putting on is around here. So horses, all just like us, they all put their fat on in different places, and that's why we condition score so carefully like this, to be able to cover those sorts of things. So all the fat's going around his belly, because his ribs are well covered and need pressure to feel. We'd say that's around a 4. So, but he doesn't, he's kind of, because he's coming back into work, he doesn't have that kind of muscle and also too much fat around his top line. So we would say on the condition scoring thing that he is a 4. Then if we look at his hindquarters, so again, he's just coming back into work, so she's given us some good different angles there. So you can see, in fact, you can kind of see the differentiation in his wither. So we don't really have a gutter here. You can see there's a nice shape coming down.
Sorry, Tamzin, we just lost you there for a little bit.
Sorry about that. Hopefully that helps. Am I back? Am I back? Is that okay?
I think you're good now. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, we can see there are some dimples here, which are kind of obvious. We don't have too much. We don't have other fat pads around the tail head, and we don't really have a gutter going on here. So for him, for his hindquarters, again, we said a 4. So he's got, we can see that there's fat. We can see, and his owners said as well in the video, that it was quite hard. You could feel his hip, but it was hard to feel the other areas of his pelvis. And you can see that there are kind of some fat pads here, but we don't have too much of a gutter or anything. So needed firm pressure to feel his pelvis, but not too much of a gutter. So he's a 4. And this takes us to a 4 overall for this guy. So give yourself top marks if, when you looked at him overall, you guessed 4. Okay, moving on to pony number 3. So here we have the Highland. So again, we really wanted to include a Highland type because they're so interesting, and people often think that condition scoring won't work for their horse because their horse is kind of a really chunky build like Highlands are. And also they're incredibly hard to keep the weight off sometimes. So yeah, just again in the chat, what are your initial impressions of this lovely girl?
Okay, we've got 2 4s, another 4, yeah, 1 5.
Okay.
So 2 5s, or 2 4.5s.
Okay.
So a mixture of kind of between 4 and 5.
Okay, lovely. Okay, nice. So let's look at her in detail. So if we just start with her neck, so let's imagine touching her neck and feeling where that nuchal ligament, where those ropes are coming down her neck. So again, you can quite easily imagine taking off, or I can anyway, maybe I'm weird, I don't know, maybe I've thought about this too much, but anyway, I can quite easily imagine that her neck could be here, and therefore we can see that the crest, she's quite good actually, and you can see this in the one later as well, that you can imagine her neck would be here, and that actually you can see a crest kind of rising out of her withers there and coming back down to where the nuchal ligament is. So we can see that there's a crest there, not huge. And so you can see the owner's comment, she's getting a crest, but not as prominent as that bay pony. And the hand stops at the shoulder, but she does have fat pads. So this is a good example of, if you run your hand down her shoulder, you can see it would kind of blend in between her neck and shoulder here. And if you imagine running your hand over her withers, again, you're not going to get very much differentiation there between her neck, her withers, her shoulder blade and her neck. Lovely as she is, that is a little on the round side. So we would say that there is some crest there, and there are fat pads in front of and behind the shoulder there. So we would give her a 4.5. Then if we move on to her midsection, so the owner said that you can actually feel her ribs, and if we imagine you can see we've already talked about the fat pad behind the shoulder, but actually you can see here behind the wither that there is some kind of differentiation of the back, and the owner can feel her ribs, which you wouldn't necessarily kind of guess just from looking at, I mean, no offense to her, she's lovely, I don't mean that in a bad way, but looking at the overall picture, you might think you couldn't feel them too well. However, you can. So from that, so we need to think about, so ribs well covered, but you need pressure to feel, would be a 4. Ribs buried cannot be felt, would be a 5. We can see that her back is quite flat along here, as we talked about before. So imagine if you put your hand over her back, it would come off quite flat. So we've given her a 4.5 here, but talk to the owner, because it does depend on how easy it is to feel those ribs. So we've said 4.5 based on the kind of overall picture of her barrel, the flatness on the top and so on, but this would depend totally on feeling. You couldn't really say just from looking on her. Then if we look at her hindquarters, so here the owner has said that the hip skeleton is a struggle to find. She has fat at the top of the tailbone and an apple-shaped bottom. So she has a good example of an apple-shaped bottom here, which a lot of Highlands do anyway, even when they're fit. However, the fact that the owner has said that you can't find the actual structures of the skeleton shows that most of that is going to be fat. We can also see this gutter kind of running along the tail and see these fat pads here just on either side of the tail head, and you can kind of see from the wider picture. So again, if we think about looking at this side of the condition scoring chart, so 4 would be a gutter to the root of the tail, pelvis covered by fat and needs firm pressure to feel. 5 would mean that the pelvis is buried and cannot be felt. Because the owner said that it was really hard to actually feel her pelvis, we've given her a 4.5 here. But again, this would be one where you'd want to really get your hands on the horse to be able to condition score accurately. As I said, Highlands in particular can sometimes have quite a lot of muscle in their hindquarters, which can be quite deceptive. So you do want to be able to feel and see how springy that fat is, and to be looking for the kind of fat pads that wobble around. Usually the ones around the tail head, that's definitely fat, but sometimes around here, if you feel, you can tell what's kind of muscle versus fat. Okay, so that gave this lovely lady a 4.5 overall. So full marks, if that was your guess. Number 4, we've got this lovely chestnut mare. So what are your thoughts? Let's have in the chat.
Okay, we have 1 3,
Okay.
another 3. Oh, threes, lots of threes coming through. A few
Okay.
3.5s, 1 2.5.
Mm,
So we've got another 2.5. So we've got sort of a range from 2.5 up to 3.5.
Great. Okay. So, so let's look at her in detail. So if we look at her neck, the owner said, I could feel the ligaments all the way down her neck and her shoulders are defined. So this is the pony, if you remember Dee saying before that she, poor girl, had an accident where she fell on her withers. So her withers are very flat, which makes it quite hard to condition score her, because we don't know just from looking whether this is scar tissue, whether it's muscle that's built up in a funny way, or whether these are fat pads. So all the way through this pony, we wanted to show this one in particular just because it's such a good example of one that you really cannot accurately condition score from a photograph, and a really good example of why it's so important to get your hands on a horse. But anyway, we're going to talk you through her. So yeah, lots of people said 3. So 3 on a neck would be no crest at all. Now, interestingly, we did actually think there was a little bit of, if you can imagine kind of through her poll where her nuchal ligament is, there is a little layer of fat above there, only a bit. And you can imagine your hand would stop at her shoulder. However, it's not clearly defined, and the fact that over her withers, we don't have much kind of too much differentiation in this area. We've given that area a 3.5, but as I said, this pony is really interesting shape because of her accident that she had, and therefore we have a question mark there, because we want to be able to feel that area. And this is probably one where you'd also want to maybe talk to a physiotherapist, for example, about specifically what's going on there, and what the structures are in her neck. So we gave her a 3.5 for this area, but with a question mark. Then if we look at the slightly bigger picture of her, so the owner said, I can see her ribs and feel them. However, her back only has a very slight curve. So I think if you can imagine on this sort of diagonal picture here, if you were to put your hands on her back, you can imagine that it would come off almost flat. And it does look slightly like there's a bit of a dip there in her spine, and we can also see that there's a kind of, as you go down to her belly, there's a bit of a fat pad here. But the owner said that she can feel her ribs easily and see them, I assume, in some lights. So now that's an interesting one, because the fact that you can, so 3 would be ribs just covered and easily felt, which sounds like what the owner is describing. However, you would also want to be able to feel the backbone. The backbone would be covered, but you'd want to be able to feel the individual vertebrae, which you can't usually on a horse that's got that kind of flat back. So because she's got quite a flat back, and from that top view, looks like there's kind of more fat along her back there. We know she's not in work, so it's unlikely to be muscle. We've given her a 3.5, but again, this would be very dependent on putting your hands on her. She's quite an interesting shape because of the things that she's been through. So again, we've got a question mark there. She's a really interesting pony from that point of view, which is why we thought she was a really good case study. And then again, if you look at her hindquarters, now what I love about this is so interesting, because if you look at this picture, you would think this was a completely different pony in comparison to her hindquarters almost, when we're talking about condition scoring. So some people gave her a 2.5 from the side, but her hindquarters is where she's carrying a reasonable, you know, that seems to be where most of her weight is going on. So I think we all know the feeling of most of our weight going on our bum and hips, maybe. So perhaps she's the equivalent. There's not a huge amount there, but more than on other areas of her body. So as you can see, there's a bit of a gutter along the top here. You can see that gap, a small amount of fat pads. The owner said, I can feel her hip. She has a little fat on the top of her pelvis, sorry, and I can feel her tailbone, but there may be a little fat on it. So it sounds like she's pretty well covered over here. And if you imagine running your hands over her hindquarters, then you could imagine being able, you could probably feel her pelvis, particularly if you look from the side here. Sorry, the chat's in the way. There you go. Particularly look from the side, it looks like you could feel her pelvis and hip quite easily. However, from the top, there's a reasonable amount of fat deposits. They're kind of burying that. So again, really good example of a really interesting pony to condition score. And again, we have a question mark for this one as well. So again, we would say 3.5. So we'd give her a 3.5 overall. I'm just going to give you the overall view of the pony again there. A 3.5 overall, but really interesting pony, and a really good example of how they can carry fat differently in different areas, and why it's so important that we therefore separate those areas out and look in detail at the condition score rather than just looking at the overall view of the pony. So full marks to anyone who got 3.5. Okay, then last but not least, we have this lovely 3-year-old pony. So what are people's thoughts here? So this one's sporting some really lovely plaits as well. Her owners, full marks to this one for making the effort. So you'll see her plaits in a minute. What have we got for the...
Okay, we have 1.5, a 4, 4.5, another couple of 4.5s.
Okay.
Yeah, so one person saying it's hard to tell from the stance because she does have her head down, so that does make it a little bit more difficult.
That is true.
Yeah, so I think we're ranging from about 4 to 4 from 4 to 5.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Okay, and again, we wanted to make sure we included a traditional cob because again, people find it very difficult to apply condition scoring sometimes to traditional cobs and feel that that it's going that, you know, because the horse is quite a bulky build, it doesn't make sense to use the same scale on a thoroughbred that you could use on a traditional cob. But so hopefully we'll show you how you can apply that. So yeah, overall, yeah, agreed, it's hard to see. She's having a nice munch on something there, but agreed, it's hard to see exactly from this angle. But let's look at her bit by bit. So if we look at her neck here, so first of all, we'll just imagine that nuchal ligament along the top of her neck. Look where her poll is, look where her withers are. Is there some extra there? So yeah, there's not a huge crest, but there is definitely some, there is a marked crest there. You can see that kind of rainbow shape. We know she's not in work because she's only a baby. So, you know, if we weren't sure, we would know that that wasn't going to be from muscle. And you can see from this angle, you can see that it's kind of, there's a little bit of a kind of bulge out there. So that shows that there is a crest, if we weren't sure if it was kind of her neck shape or not. So then if we imagine running a hand down her neck from her, from this area down towards her shoulder, so we can see that it would stop there actually, which is nice. And you can see here, you can see a bit of differentiation in the shoulder. However, around the top of the shoulder here, we can see there's no differentiation between the neck, wither, and shoulder area. And on this one, we can see there's a kind of fat pad behind the shoulder here. So if you ran your hand down, it would stop here, which is definitely a good start. However, there's quite a lot of fat buildup in this area, which we know is not going to be kind of muscle at this stage. So, so how would we condition score that? So looking at the neck area of this, so number 4 would be slight crest, wide and firm, but we also need to take into account the other areas of fat that we've got on this pony. So we would say that she's probably a 4.5 on her neck, but again, we want to feel that. Then if we look at her midsection, so you can kind of see in this photo, well, sorry, I spelled it again, sorry. So we can kind of see on this photo on the left here, I don't know if you can see on your screens, but if you imagine you know, running your hand down behind her withers, it looks pretty pretty flat behind her withers, and if you imagine having your hand across her back, it would probably come off quite flat there. And we don't know if that's a dorsal stripe or whether that's a bit of a gutter there. You can also see that here there's a complete, it's going to be completely flat behind the fat pad here, running into her stomach belly area. So we know that that means that there's kind of fat pads along here, and that her ribs were quite hard to feel, the owner said. So what does that mean? So in the middle area, we've got 4 ribs well covered and need pressure to feel, but we need to think about the fact she's also got that fat along the top of her back here, and between the withers and the back area. So here we've given her a 4.5. And then looking at her hindquarters with this very nice tail, beautifully plaited there. So again, on the hindquarters, so again, we can see there's a bit of a gutter here. Now you can see that even though she's got a slightly darker dorsal stripe. And if you imagine trying to feel her pelvis around here, you can imagine on this one as well, it would be quite hard to feel the point of her hip and where the pelvis kind of moves around. You know, there would be some in there. There's definitely kind of room for maneuver, but equally there is still quite a lot of fat covering there. So if we look at the different parts of the condition score, so a 5 would be a deep gutter from the root to the tail. Pelvis cannot be felt. 4 would be a gutter and the pelvis is covered by fat and needs firm pressure to feel. So again, we've given her a 4.5, and we would give her therefore a 4.5 overall because of those 3 scores. I'll just show you the overall picture again, which I think is quite interesting when you look at her. My first thought when I saw the overall picture of her was probably a little bit less than that, but this owner's done a really good job. She has already lost quite a lot of weight, and we hopefully can talk to Claire in the chat in a minute about losing weight with a horse that's still growing, because of course she's only 3. It's a lovely pony. So before we move on, I just want to say a huge thank you to the owners that sent us in those case studies. It's a really brave thing to be able to share pictures of your horses, especially if you're feeling like they are, if you think that they're overweight. And the owners were all incredibly careful with how they sent us those pictures and talked to us about their weight. You know, they were really conscientious about how they did it, and really kind to be able to share those and show those sorts of things. And it's really great that we've been able to have such a range of horses as well. I hope that's been helpful for everyone to see. So a huge thank you to those owners. I think all of them mentioned about the weight management that they're actually using, and next week we're going to talk about weight management methods, so it might be useful and interesting to talk to those owners as well about what they're doing kind of moving forward. So just have a look at all those 4 or 5 ponies again. I can't even count now. 5 ponies again, and your initial views when you first looked at them, and what you think now having looked. Now, are there any surprises there? Anything anyone was really surprised about, or things that you disagree with us about as well? Please feel free to put that in the chat, and we'd be more than happy to talk about that later. Obviously this is something you can be trained to do, but it's also subjective as well. So if there are things that you know, would disagree with, we're more than happy to talk that through and why we scored those in the way that we did. So the things I really want to point out are how different your initial impression is compared to an actual condition score. So I think this bay pony is probably the best example of that. You know, she from this picture looks really quite fit, and she is in lovely condition, but there is some excess weight on her, which the owner was very honest about, because it doesn't always totally come through in the photographs. Again, this pony up here, a really good example of why it's so important that you put your hands on a horse, and that's why we've only given question marks rather than a proper you know, an actual definite score.
Yeah, so we've had, sorry Tamzin, we've had one, actually 2 people say that the chestnut was the biggest surprise for them.
Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, especially because some people put this pony as underweight. I think is really interesting as well, on a 2.5, slightly underweight. Yeah, and I totally agree. When I looked at the hindquarters pictures on this pony, it didn't. She doesn't look like the rest. It doesn't look like what you would expect from the side picture. So really, yeah, thank you. Any other comments there, or?
Not for these ponies, but we.
Okay. Excellent. Well, we can pick them up after. So if anyone's
we can pick up.
Then great. Oops. Oh, sorry. Oh yes, I forgot I did this. Okay, so yeah, so we had 4.5 for the Highlands, and the young pony in the middle, 3.5 with a question mark for the chestnut pony, 4 for the PRE, and also 4 for the New Forest there. So just a reminder, so you can get these condition scoring charts absolutely free anywhere, and we'll put a link up afterwards. So you can just literally type in condition scoring chart for a horse, or indeed a dog or a cat if you get really keen. You know, feel free to condition score your pets, that's fun too. And it's really interesting because it's a little bit different, but it gets you really used to feeling, so feeling for that skeleton and feeling for what's fat on different animals. So I love condition scoring my cat, but I am a mega geek, as you can tell, so forgive me. So in terms of kind of moving forward and how to succeed, so there are some common mistakes that people make, which you guys can avoid, having talked to us today, hopefully. So the most common mistake people do is to just eyeball the horse and just look at it rather than doing an actual condition score, breaking the horse down into 3 and remembering to use the charts. Another common mistake is people don't ask for help, which is totally understandable because it's not very nice. If you're worried your horse is a little overweight, it can be a bit scary to ask for that, because you have to, you know, it's hard to hear something you don't want to hear. So I totally understand why, but it's really important to ask for help, because then that means that we can have our professionals or trusted friends, for example, working with us and helping us. Lots of people say, I sometimes see on social media people saying that the vet or farrier are getting at them because they're constantly going on about their horse's weight. Now, from studying this, I can tell you that vets and farriers absolutely hate having to have this discussion with people about weight. They find it really hard to bring up a lot of the time, although obviously that does depend on their personalities. There are some, you know, I do talk to some farriers, especially older male farriers sometimes, I think, not to stereotype, but who love telling people when their horses are fat. But generally, most vets and farriers say that they find it really difficult to bring up with an owner when the horse is overweight, because they don't want to make you feel bad. So a really nice way of getting around that is, and your vet and farrier will love you for it, because you'll look so much like you're really keen and you really care about your horse, and they won't have to mention it. It's just to ask them every single time, how do you think they're looking weight wise? Do you think they're okay compared to the last visit? So you can initiate that conversation, which is a bit less scary for you, but also means that you can keep that track of your horse's weight over time. And it may be that they can point out areas of that. I mean, we talked about the main areas where fat goes on, but there are some areas which aren't on the condition scoring scale because they're quite kind of rare, but there are some. So some horses get, for example, a little bit of a fat pad above their eyes. Sometimes we see fat pads on the belly, gelding sometimes on their sheath area, even behind the between the hind legs. So having your vet or farrier help you to look at those might mean that they're able to spot some areas. My horse actually gets moobs, bless him, poor thing, when he gets a bit fat. So it may be that there are other areas which aren't really covered on the condition scoring chart because they're not the main areas, but where your horse is holding the fat. As I said, some people think condition scoring charts don't really apply to their horse, because if you're scoring a more sporty type horse like this, then how could it apply to a cob? But I hope that we've showed you today how it's the same principles, the imagining your hand sliding down the neck, looking at the top line overall and whether your hand would be flat, feeling for fat behind the shoulder area and so on, are the same no matter what breed of horse you have. There are some differences with conformation, and again, that's where your professionals, instructors, vets, farriers, blah, blah, can all help you. And the final one is to assume it's top line or muscle when, you know, if you haven't been working your horse that hard or he hasn't been doing the right type of work, it's quite unlikely they're going to be building muscle over the top line. But we really commonly see people saying, so actually if you look at this horse here where she's thinner, she looks like she's got less top line. However, in this picture she is quite overweight. So this owner might have said, she definitely didn't, I know that, I know the owner, but this owner might have said, oh, she's got a lot more top line in this picture, but actually she is larger, and in this picture she was much fitter. So we do need to take into account the amount of work the horse is doing when we're thinking about what's fat and what's muscle, particularly in those areas. So the things that you can do to change that are to use the chart every time. So just download it on your phone, print it out, whatever works for you, and use it every time. Ask the professionals to help you, and be open to their help, because you know they won't want to offend you, hopefully hopefully not anyway, and you know it opens the way to having that kind of meaningful discussion, and then they can help you longer term, which is great. And condition score carefully for your individual horse, because your horse will be different. So you can get used to seeing, is your horse one of those, you know, the equivalent of someone who puts all their weight on their behind, or are they the equivalent of someone who puts all their weight up the top or on their legs or whatever, because your horse will be an individual on that. And then also, just like this horse here, it's really nice to be able to take pictures and write everything down and compare it, so you can see that change over time. So if you're trying to get your horse to lose weight or gain weight, then using a condition scoring as well as, for example, a weigh tape can help you see how that change is going. So condition scoring, it does take quite a while to see change going down. So my horse managed to go up a condition score in 2 weeks at the start of spring, which was a bit horrendous, but it would take a lot longer than 2 weeks to go down a condition score, unfortunately. So that's where a weigh tape is quite nice to check that you're moving slowly in the right direction, because a weigh tape will be quicker. But as I said, the condition scoring is useful for seeing kind of what's fat and helping you, and then you can use that as a gauge over time. So hopefully we can all end up with lovely healthy horses. I just like including this picture because we were running a scheme in showing classes where we were rewarding people with the healthy horses of the healthiest weight, and this girl with her lovely Highland pony and section B here won 2 on the same day, having previously been told that her horses were underweight at some shows. But as you can see, both of these horses, you've got really lovely definition over the shoulder, belly area, and they were both in absolutely beautiful conditions. So hopefully we can all work together towards that. And as a result, we're planning to have these some sessions as we move forward. So next week, talking about different methods of weight management, and we've got some guest speakers coming in to talk to us about the different ways that you can reduce weight. I've just put up as an example here what we can talk about the different things that you can do, and the different ways you can think about weight management specifically for your horse, and kind of go beyond the boring weight management that we don't like doing, shutting horses away in stables, soaking hay and so on, and think a bit more creatively about it. So I will stop rabbiting on there, but Dee and I are really keen to talk to you a bit more about any questions that you might have, and of course hopefully catch up with Claire in just a second. So I'm just going to put up some useful links. So there's in fact, we'll just share these later on.
Yeah, I'll pop them in the chat.
Brilliant.
And I think hopefully we can. We've got a couple of sort of questions and comments we can address at the end, but shall we crack on and get Claire online? And...
Great. Yeah, that would be fantastic. Okay, do we have Claire waiting?
So I do see one Claire on there. Shall we ask her to unmute her mic?
Ask to unmute.
Hi there.
Hi.
Hi.
Is that working?
Perfect. Yes, thank you.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, brilliant. I'll stop the chat.
Lovely.
Great. Hi Claire, how are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me along. Brilliant talk, really useful, really practical. Yeah, it was really good. Thank you.
Oh,
thank you very much for joining us. So did you want to sort of, I'm sure a lot of people know you, but maybe say a little bit about yourself, and then we've got sort of a few questions set aside for you already. But if people would like any questions in the comments about nutrition while dieting their ponies or trying to get them to lose weight, we'll ask Claire here to very kindly answer them.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Right, how can I say it in just a few words? So I'm a little bit unusual in that I'm an independent nutritionist. I don't work directly for any feed company. I don't make any of my income from any companies, which means that I basically can tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, which is great because there is a shortage of that sort of resource in this industry, really. I'm also registered with the Association for Nutrition, and that's an assurance of my qualifications and my experience level, really. So it gives horse owners assurance of the fact that I am correctly trained and have the right experience. Yes, I think that's probably the main point. So I have my own horses as well. And I also have one that went up 1 condition score in 2 weeks, Tamzin.
Oh, I'm glad it's not just me.
Unbelievable how quick they can put it on.
I know.
So yeah, and I'm looking forward to questions. It'll be great to hear some questions and hopefully give all the owners on here some help.
Great. Okay.
Cool. Shall I start quickly with the youngsters? So we, if you saw in our body condition scoring case study, we had a 3-year-old that was quite overweight, and the owner would sort of like some information about obviously getting the horse to lose weight, but she's a bit worried about maybe having nutrient deficiencies that might stop her growth or development not going correctly. So if you could maybe say a little bit about nutrition in a young horse while dieting.
Yeah, that's a nice challenging one to start with, isn't it? Yeah, it isn't so easy. You have to be a little bit more careful. But on the other hand, actually, after 2 years old, their actual nutrient requirements don't vary that much. So although they will still keep growing after that time, you won't do any harm by really restricting them the same way as you would for an adult from the age of 2. And to be honest, if you're looking, and generally it's not that easy to get such fast weight loss that you'll cause developmental problems in a horse that's 2 years plus. You'd have to almost half-starve them to cause a problem. So I think as long as you're looking for gradual weight loss and doing all the usual kind of adult weight loss implementations, you won't do any harm. And in fact, you'll do a huge amount more harm if you leave a 2 or 3 year old at a condition score of over 4. It's really going to be quite harmful for their long-term health. And just like for us, it gets harder as they get older, really. So getting on top of that now will really help that horse's long-term health.
Great. And sorry, can I just ask a follow-up to that? And what would you consider to be sort of a safe rate of weight loss? Obviously, we don't want to crash diet them too quickly, but we do want to see some progress.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there is. Now, most owners I find don't have weight bridges. So actually talking about kilos per week or month isn't that helpful. What I tend to do for owners generally who would have normal facilities is say you're just looking for your I'm like Tamzin, I would say use a weight tape because you can see changes there more quickly than the actual condition scoring. Obviously the condition scoring tells you about the fat, so that's really important. But as long as that measurement is going down and you're restricting as much as you can without having a detrimental effect on their welfare, so things like you don't want to restrict the forage for more than they have more than 4 hours without anything to eat, for example. So as long as you're implementing some changes and they're actually going down on that weight tape measurement, that's absolutely fine. You're going in the right direction. I mean, it's slightly different if you have a clinical case where you've got a laminitic that's at death's door, but for a relatively appearingly healthy horse, sort of not a drastic laminitic or a severe EMS case, then as long as that weight tape measurement's going down, that's fine. That's almost good enough.
Great. We have the dreaded question in the chat here, which Tamzin and I have spent quite some time debating. How long would you recommend soaking hay for?
Soaking hay?
Yeah.
It's a $1 million question, isn't it?
Yeah, but you can put this one to bed now. Now we'll just quote you forever. Whatever Claire says.
I was just revising because it's a brilliant document. Your document on the grass is greener, I think it's called. You can download it from your site. Absolutely really brilliant, practical, helpful document. I was just having a little revision because I do recommend it regularly. And I think you mentioned in there about soaking between 6 and 12 hours. I think that's a really good practical answer because the truth is you need to soak your hay for long enough to cause weight loss where you need it without having to restrict the amount more than is healthy. And that's kind of long-winded, but that's the thing, because you don't know what you're starting with. If you're starting with a hay with its really high calorie, high digestible energy, then that's going to need a much longer soak than one that is lower calorie. And unless you analyse, and even then, you basically need to soak for a certain amount of time, monitor what's going on, if the horse isn't losing weight, soak for longer. We tend to say maximum 12-hour soak, especially in summer, because after that you are going to get some degradation that's unhelpful going on. It's not ideal to soak for 12 hours. You probably do get some bacterial fermentation, especially in summer. But in my experience, many cases, the downsides are far outweighed by the benefits of actually getting the weight down of the obese horse. That's why soaking is a necessary evil in many cases. In terms of actual, what am I going to do? How long am I going to soak? I think it's a case of you want to almost soak for short enough time to get the weight loss. And if you're soaking for just 2 hours or even 6 and nothing's happening, that's when we want to be soaking for longer. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
It's a long-winded answer, but it really does depend.
Yeah, no, definitely. And sort of just to reiterate to owners to keep monitoring, because if you're not monitoring, you don't know which way it's going, and then you don't know how you need to adjust things. Yeah,
absolutely.
Cool, thank you. Tamzin, do you want to ask some?
Okay, brilliant. So, okay, so someone's asked, we were talking earlier on about not crash dieting, and someone's asked what would happen if they were put on a crash diet, and could you tell us a bit about how to make sure that we're feeding enough whilst putting the horse on a diet, if you see what I mean, so that we avoid the problems?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So the main issue with crash dieting, which in practice you don't see very often, but it can happen, is that the animal goes into a state of toxicity from fat being mobilized from the liver. More common in donkeys and small ponies, and it can be fatal, but it's rare. And that would be your classic old-fashioned, the pony's got laminitis, you pop it in the stable and give it one slice of hay for 24 hours, which most owners wouldn't do nowadays. So it's unusual for it to be that dangerous. That's your kind of main health risk. And in terms of working out how little you have to feed or how to restrict the feed, what I tend to say practically is you always want to start with ad lib forage, which is free choice, because that's your ideal situation. And if you could find a low enough calorie hay to do that and implement weight loss, or hay stroke grass, that would be great. In reality, it doesn't really exist. Even quite poor hay is often too calorific, which is why we need to restrict and soak it sometimes. So you start with the ideal and then you work backwards. And you can weigh, but I tend to say to owners, a sort of practical approach would be to say, restrict enough to cause the weight loss to happen, but never have the horse over 4 hours with nothing to eat, because that's the time where you'll start to see an increased risk of gastric ulcers.
Great, okay. That's a really useful rule of thumb.
Practical guidelines. And they're also different, so you do have to adjust that according to your individual.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. That's really helpful. Okay, so we've got an interesting one from a lady called Debbie, who says that she has a new horse with a fat score of 4, and the field is very grassy, and she can't section it off, so she's bringing the pony in the day, but the pony won't eat hay when she's in the day, so she's worried about her going out and gorging the grass when she goes out. Do you have any advice for someone in that sort of situation?
Yeah, I do, and I'm afraid it's really not what you want to hear, because as you also really helpfully mention in your booklet, The Grass is Greener. I'm not getting any commission for promoting this booklet. It's just brilliant. It's just really
all
good.
Freely available.
It's such a helpful booklet. And as you very correctly point out in there, research has proven that that worked on ponies, but I'm sure it applies to a lot of horses. If you restrict the amount of time they're out on grass, they will learn to eat more, and they will eat a tremendous amount in a short period of time. So having them in during the day and then having them on ad lib grass overnight is probably not going to work if they're quite overweight and they love to eat. They eat a lot. So you really are going to have to find a way to restrict the grass. In most cases, unless you've got a very big herd on a big area, I find in practice, in most cases, you just have to find a way to restrict grass, or you're just struggling with weight on an ongoing basis. So that might be strip grazing if you're allowed to at your yard. You might have to use a grazing muzzle, which not all owners like, but generally that's going to be your only way really of causing weight loss, because grass, the digestible energy, the calorie content of grass is such that unless you restrict it, you just won't get them to lose weight, never mind maintain a healthy weight, even in work, even when they're working fairly hard.
Yeah, okay. Oh, interesting. Yeah, thank you. That's such a tricky one, isn't it? I totally empathise with that question. You can see them. In fact, Dee and I were talking about this, weren't we, Dee? When you put them out and they haven't been on the grass, and then you can see the bite rate is there. You know, they're like little crocodiles. Like, yeah, it's tough. Okay, I'll do one more and then I'll hand over to Dee, if that's okay. I'm just going to take a question from the owner of the PRE that we saw in there. So she adds a supplement called Clare XEO3 oil as an omega
Kentucky Equine Research, I think it is, isn't it?
As an omega-3 source to help with his hoof inflammation. And I thought this might also be interesting for people who are feeding, for example, micronized linseed or something for a reason other than weight. So if people are feeding supplements like that kind of thing, but they're also trying to lose weight for their horses, what do you recommend with those sorts of situations?
Yeah, that's a really good question, isn't it? So the key thing is the amount of oil that you're feeding. If it's a really concentrated omega-3 and say you're only feeding, I don't know, 25, 50 millilitres, a couple of tablespoons, that will be fine if you're, as you see on human nutrition, if you're feeding it with a balanced diet. So if the rest of the diet is calorie restricted enough, then you'll be able to feed that oil. If you've got a really severe acute case of a laminitic that's, you know, condition score 5 and is in trouble for their, you know, staying alive, then that's when you really might have to be very strict with calories, to the point where you'll probably end up with a few other health problems by restricting. But that would be quite an unusual, more acute case. With a case like this horse, if it's just a tablespoon or 2 of oil a day and the rest of the diet is calorie restricted enough that you're getting some weight loss over the weeks, that will be fine. You can still get weight loss adding a little bit of oil.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, that's really helpful, thank you. Dee, do you want to do some?
Cool, yeah, so we have a question from Sam. We've got quite a few questions coming in, so we're going to try our best to answer them all. So firstly, what would you recommend to be the feeding rate for weight loss? So for example, this owner is asking, I'm trying to get my horse to lose weight. They're currently at a body condition score of 4. How long would you feed at 1.5% of body weight of soaked hay for? And would you go we probably don't want to go down below 1.5 without sort of veterinary advice.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I know what it's like. We all want prescription. It's so much easier if you've got prescription, and you can in certain areas of this whole procedure or this whole process. But I think the most important thing is what we've mentioned a few times. You really do need to keep monitoring your horse or pony. I do have a lot of owners who have implemented some changes, and then they're really frustrated they're not working. But the key is you've got to look at the horse in front of you. And even if you decide to go for 1.5% of soaked hay in 24 hours and the horse doesn't get any grass intake, if that isn't causing weight loss in your horse, you need to do something different. So that might be trying to source a later cut, more stocky hay and still soaking it. Might be soaking your hay for longer. If you're only doing 6 hours, you might need to do 12. It might be trying to source some clean, unsprayed straw, cereal straw, to mix with the hay. So you can start with numbers, but you have to monitor your horse. And if you're not getting the changes that you are looking for, you need to change something. And although numbers and percent body weight of hay can be very useful, most horses will be getting some grass. So therefore, it's going to be a bit difficult to work out exactly how much hay you need by taking into account how much grass they're eating. And that's where that rule of maximum 4-hour fast comes in. You basically, if they're out off the grass, you want to feed them just enough forage that they have enough to eat with no more than just a few hours running out of food. It's a kind of fluffy guide, but it's really the best practical way of ensuring that you're feeding little enough to cause that weight loss.
Okay.
Yeah, and sometimes perhaps, as you said, trying to source some really kind of low nutritional value things, or even straw.
Yeah.
So kind of still keeping the diet bulky so that they don't run out, but sort of avoiding too many calories.
Yeah.
And actually, I mean, this is a kind of follow-on question, but Dee just mentioned straw there. So someone in the chat said that they were recommended that alpha A molasses free could be fed, you know, ad lib like that, and would not add weight at all. Is this true? So is there anything that you can feed, whether it's alpha A molasses free or not, that would never add weight to the horse?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think probably the only thing that you could truly feed ad lib and could be guaranteed not to cause weight gain would be straw.
Right.
Either like a clean chopped straw you can buy, straight chopped straw in bags that's been dust extracted, or even just like an unsprayed clean small bale straw. You certainly wouldn't want to feed alpha A, even if it's molasses free, ad lib, because a lot of horses and ponies love it and they would eat an awful lot of it. It would cost a lot of money as well. And many owners believe that if you have something that's low sugar, then it will cause weight loss or it won't cause weight gain. But we have to remember that it's not the sugar, it's the calories, it's the digestible energy that's linked to whether or not they're putting on or losing body fat. Now, you can't completely throw sugar out because there is an effect of sugar. Obviously, higher sugar feeds would tend to be more calorific. And if you've got any insulin resistance or dysregulation going on, then the sugar is important. But when we're looking at body fat levels, it's the digestible energy that you need to focus on. Sugar comes second. But just because something's molasses free, it certainly doesn't mean that it's a safe feed for an overweight horse. I've digressed a little bit, but I thought that was important to mention.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. Can I just do one that I think will be really interesting to everyone? Sorry, to jump in. Someone's asked about using track systems for weight loss, and I just wondered on your views on that, Claire.
I'm really glad that's been brought up, actually, because it's becoming a lot more common, and I've got owners, and in fact I do it myself, building little mini track systems within actual fields. The track systems can be great in order to increase movement whilst restricting grass, but I would certainly warn owners not to rely on them to restrict grass enough. So in the early days of track systems, I was having quite a few clients contacting me, horse owners, where they couldn't understand why their horse was getting too fat or not losing weight because they're on a track, but they can still oversupply grass. So there's no guarantee that your horse will stay slim, but many of them are easier to manage, or they'll stay slimmer on those kind of systems. And when you've got quite a few horses in together and you've got enough space, they often will move around more, which is helpful.
Great. Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, I think we've probably all seen some track systems work really well for some horses, and then others where there's still quite a lot of grass and it's just impossible. We've just got too much grass in this country, haven't we? It's insane.
Yeah, we have.
Too much grass. We need more sheep. I think. Okay, brilliant. Sorry, I'll hand back over to Dee.
Oh, it's fine. We just had one question that came in sort of before here, asking about sort of the nutritional content of things like clover, or kind of other things that we might give our horses as treats, cleavers, or the hedging plants and things like that, and what your thoughts are on those.
Yeah, there's some brilliant questions. I think it's lovely. Just on a slight aside, how much horse owners are thinking about all these things nowadays, which is lovely. It's really good. Yeah, and it's a good question. So where you've got plants like clover growing in your pasture, that's not ideal, because clover is higher, and generally higher in digestible energy, very palatable, very high in protein. It's not an ideal plant to be feeding ad lib. And the problem with it in pasture is, unless they're very restricted, they're going to be able to eat quite a lot of it. So a couple of handfuls of clover isn't really a problem, but where it's growing in the pasture, then it could be. And the same goes for your hedgerow or your herbs. If you're allowing them a nibble for 5 minutes, that's going to be a reasonable amount that's not going to throw out the calorie content of your complete diet. But if they've got access to hedgerows and they've got access to ad lib young tree leaves or herbs, then yeah, that can contribute towards weight loss, definitely. It might be a little bit healthier in its nutrient content compared to straight grass, but it still could be too calorific, yeah. And some of these herbs are actually much higher in sugar than regular meadow grasses as well.
Oh, cool. Okay. So in good, but in moderation.
Yeah, just like Maltesers for us. They're perfectly good, but definitely in moderation.
Oh, what? No moderation with Maltesers required, surely. Okay.
So we've had a few sort of grazing muzzle questions kind of from My Horse Won't Eat with one. And I know sort of a National Equine Welfare Council has some good guidance on how to introduce muzzles and use them. So we can point that owner there. But there's also questions about a young horse, so a 3-year-old that's out on grass, and would it be okay to introduce a muzzle to a young horse when grazing, and how do you kind of balance, oh, sorry, I'm just trying to read this other question, just trying to lump all the muzzling ones together. So would you leave out 24/7 but wear a muzzle? So would it be okay to wear a grazing muzzle sort of 24 hours a day when out on grazing, I guess?
Yeah, and great questions. Yeah, I guess to make it a bit quicker, that's a great resource that you mentioned to go to for more information about using grazing muzzles, because they can take a little bit of time for the horse to get used to them, and just feeding some grass or bits of hay through the muzzle hole can really help. And also being patient, because generally most of them will get used to how to use them, but it can take a couple of days, and it can be quite distressing actually for the owner. And you know, I'm not joking, it really kind of went through with my own mare actually when I couldn't strip graze. It can be quite distressing, but you have to keep remembering that you are implementing this for long-term good. And once horses or ponies get used to grazing muzzles, it can just be brilliant for them. They can go out with a herd, they can move around more than strip grazing, they can be out moving around but still able to lose weight and then maintain a healthy weight. So they're worth persisting with. In terms of age, absolutely no problem at all. Again, from age 2 onwards, not a problem at all to use a grazing muzzle. They can still eat, they can still graze. They certainly reduce the rate of intake, but that's what we're trying to do really. And the amount you use them will depend on their body condition and how that's going up or down. In terms of the length of time you use them, there is little point in taking them off and then allowing the horse to have a few hours, because the horse will learn very quickly to eat at 4 times the rate.
Yeah.
I've seen that happen quite a lot. I would say for most owners, try not to leave them on 24/7 if you don't have to, as in, can you get the animal off, or the horse or pony off the grass for a certain period of time. On the other hand, I have got clients that do use them 24/7, and it's the only way they've found to work with their practical environment and management regime, and they haven't robbed too badly, and they've managed to kind of get by with them. So it's not an ideal situation, but it is possible in some horses and ponies.
That's great.
Yeah.
I keep hearing about these new flexible fillies muzzles. Again, I'm not on any commission or anything. I mean, they are horrendously expensive, but lots of owners who have had troubles with them before seem to be saying that the flexible fillies one are a lot lighter and a lot nicer for the horses to wear. I don't know. Have you come across those?
Well, I haven't got a lot of feedback yet, but I have heard a couple of owners say that they've had success with them. And I think with muzzles, different horses seem to suit different muzzles or owners. So it's never possible for me to recommend one, because I've had so many different muzzles recommended by different owners and had good feedback. So you sometimes just have to find the one that will work for you and your horse, which can be an expensive process because some of them aren't too cheap.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, here's a good question for you, Claire. Has haylage got less calories than hay?
Haylage got less calories. That's a brilliant question, and the answer is, it's the truth, honestly, it depends. I mean, it really does depend, especially nowadays. Now, even compared with 10 years ago, the analysis that I see coming through for haylage and hay varies so widely in each type of forage that you can't assume anything anymore. So I'll see quite dry late cut haylages that are less calorific than some early cut meadow hay. But then you'll also see haylages that are more calorific than hay that you wouldn't expect. Haylage does tend to be more palatable, so if you feed ad lib, the horse would generally tend to end up taking in more calories, unless it's a very low calorie haylage. But really, the answer is you can't assume.
Yeah.
You really can't assume. you just always, with an overweight horse, looking for as low calorie forage as you can.
Great. Okay.
And we could have it. We could probably do another half an hour to explain how to do that. Maybe that's another session.
Another session. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, we're always looking for new topics, so that'll be great.
Yeah, and actually afterwards on the Facebook page, if people want to request certain topics, we have lots of ideas, but we'd love to hear your ideas as well. So
how are you for time, Claire? Do you want to do a couple more questions?
I'm happy to. I'm fine. I've got plenty of time. Yep.
Well, that's a dangerous thing to say.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of questions here.
Okay, we've got one here from Shirley. She says, I put my horses on strip grazing and they're losing weight, but it's taking time. We are approximately 7 months in and they are still scoring around a 4, but they are losing weight. So I think this is what we kind of spoke a little bit about, that you might see the changes in body condition slower than weight, but it's kind of, I guess, well, sorry, I'm probably answering the question for you. But the positive thing is that the weight is going down. But sort of is 7 months, you know, is that sort of an extraordinarily long amount of time, or?
Yeah, no, I concur with you, and absolutely. I'd say from a practical point of view, as long as that weight tape is going down in measurement and you're never having a condition score that is increasing, then that would be okay, providing the animals, the horses or ponies, haven't got any health problems related to their body fat levels. So if you've got any kind of subclinical laminitis, or the vet's concerned about any kind of likelihood of EMS, so if there's any health problems associated with this, then I'd say yes, perhaps you need to implement something else to make this move a bit faster. But if they're otherwise healthy, and as long as the owner's quite strict, or Shirley's quite strict about keeping those records and making sure that over each month you're moving in the right direction, then keep going, because you don't want to get what's the word? You don't want to get downhearted and sort of give up. It's really hard work, and it's a long-term, persistent effort. It's exactly the same for those of us who love our food and always tend to have to struggle with our weight. You just have to keep persisting and keep being realistic and keeping those records. But like I say, for Shirley specifically, it would be a case of, well, if they've got some health problems caused by the fatness, then you would maybe want to get things moving a bit faster. But if not, keep with it.
Very good.
Thank you.
Tamzin?
A related one on that. So Debbie has asked, so how often should you monitor your horse's weight? Would you say weekly or more or less? Good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I tend to say to owners every 2 weeks and no more than that, because as we know, it can change quickly. Weekly is good, but it depends really on what the owner's, you know, what you want to do or what you're likely to do. If you're finding that weekly isn't really working for you, then 2 weekly is fine. But if you leave it any longer than that, you can start to miss changes, and then it's harder to get back. As you were saying, Tamzin, it's so true. It's so much easier for it to go on than it to come off.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And then, I mean, maybe this should be the last one or the last one but one, but we've got 2 questions about yo-yoing between summer and winter weight, which is a really interesting point. So Emily has asked, is it okay for horses to yo-yo between summer and winter, or is that old-fashioned? Should weight be stable through the year? And someone else earlier had asked, if it is okay for them to yo-yo, how much differentiation is allowed?
Yeah, that's great questions, aren't they? No, it's a really good point. I think it's maybe it is a bit old-fashioned, the yo-yoing weight, but it's perfectly natural for a horse at the end of the day. And you know, this is why, I mean, truly natural. This is the real animal operating, and this is why horses love good grass so much, because, you know, from an evolutionary point of view, they're driven to eat as much as they can during the summer so they can survive the winter. So actually it's quite okay for them to lose weight in the winter, and especially if they are overweight, you can use the winter to help them to drop weight. It's much easier in the winter when there isn't as much grass about. You probably wouldn't want them yo-yoing too much, but it doesn't really have any drastic detrimental health effects that we know of. you just don't really want them getting too obese at any point in time. So that would be the kind of argument against yo-yoing too much, as in don't let them get too fat in the summer. And also, when you implement weight loss strategies, generally it's going to involve a little bit of stress because the animal can't eat as much as they want to. So therefore, you don't really want to allow them to get so fat that you have to implement a very restricted diet. It might be a necessity to get them healthy, but it's not ideal for anybody involved, so the horse or the owner. A little bit of weight loss in the winter would be fine, but I wouldn't just let them put on exactly what they want in the summer thinking, well, I can help them lose it in the winter.
Great, okay, that's really helpful, thank you. Okay, this is definitely the last one for me. I don't know about Dee. I wondered if you could put to bed another question that comes up every single time, which is the long grass, short grass debate. So is it, if you're trying to lose weight with your horse, sometimes we hear that putting your horse on long grass is going to be better for weight loss because it's got less calories in long grass versus short grass. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm really glad this question came up. I was going to try and add it in myself because this is a classic case of where theory and things on paper don't always make sense when moved into the practical real world. If you analyse long, mature, stalky grass, which after it's gone to seed, yes, it would be lower in calories and sugar and lots of things that aren't that good for overweight horses and ponies, compared with sort of sprouting, growing, leafy grass. However, the classic thing is it's the amount of calories, it's the total amount of calories or digestible energy they take in over a set period of time that matters. That's what's going to make them put on body fat or lose it. So if you're giving them access to longer, lower calorie, lower sugar grass, but they can eat more of it, then they could end up putting on weight that they won't put on if they're on shorter, less ideal grass. And in practice, time and time again, I've seen owners who have been really successful with weight loss regimes and strategies where they've used overgrazed, not ideal grass, but basically that's helped them reduce calories enough that they could have their horses and ponies lose weight. And they'll often be feeding supplementary forage like soaked hay along with that type of pasture. But trying to get horses and ponies to lose weight on a healthy, longer grass pasture is really, really tricky. You have to strip graze really strictly.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's the equivalent of cutting out chocolate but eating loads of toast instead, sort of.
Yeah. Toast, yeah, something like toast and Marmite without butter. You can still eat 6 slices of it, can't you?
Oh, I'm hungry now.
So I think I've got probably one question left, if that's all right.
Yeah,
actually
fine.
Maybe 2.
Yeah.
So following up sort of from keeping horses on pretty bare pasture, one owner was worried about sand colic and what can we do to kind of reduce the ingestion of sand or dirt, especially we've had a really dry summer, at least here in the southeast this year.
Yeah, and another excellent question. It's a good point. And I think if you're grazing your horses or ponies on a very short grass or overgrazed pasture, that is obviously very useful for calorie restriction, but it does mean that all the forage they get is basically grass sprouts. So you do generally, for most horses and ponies, want to feed some sort of supplementary higher fibre forage. So some sort of soaked hay or some straw, something that's going to have a higher fibre content. And that will also help them if they do ingest, which they will ingest some sand or some soil, and therefore end up with some sand in their guts. That will help to move it through. And there's a little bit of debate as to whether just hay is enough or whether feeding something like psyllium husks is the most common supplement that's used to help sand removal. The research is, it's debated. One trial showed that hay was just as good as psyllium husks. Another trial showed that psyllium husks was quite useful. You can do a fecal test on their droppings to see if there's sand in there. It's not 100% reliable, but I think Westgate Laboratories, the company that do the deworming, they offer that as a test. And you can do it yourself as well, check if there is sand in the gut. So if you were worried, then certainly feed some hay out there. And you could feed psyllium husks as well, if you wanted to. And you feed them like as a short course in high amounts. But be aware of it and keep it in mind, because sometimes all these interventions won't get rid of the sand. And if you're ever worried about your horse whether they end up with a colic or something, always speak to the vet and always get that investigated. It is a risk.
Okay.
Yeah, great. And sort of keeping in the theme of poo, final question, I think, from Sally. She says, is counting poos a useful way of monitoring intake or judging how much hay or supplement on what looks like a fairly bare paddock?
Yeah, counting poo. I've got quite a few owners, clients who do that actually, and counting piles of poo can be really useful. I'm amazed at the length some horse owners go to, honestly. If I get old one day, I've got a few owners that I want to line up to be my carers because it's amazing. So no, joking apart, counting poos can be very useful. There isn't a set count that your horse needs to do in order to be healthy and lose weight. It's just basically more like a monitoring tool to work out what's going on with your individual horse, and it can help you work out how much grass your horse is getting, because obviously if they're eating everything that's growing, you can't often see how much they're actually getting. It's the body fat score and the weight tape is your key about what's going on. So for example, if you were counting droppings and you were getting the amount that you felt was right for your horse, it would be easy to be sidetracked for that and then overlook the fact they were slowly getting fatter. And like I say, there isn't a set number for a certain size of horse that is the right amount. But yeah, it's certainly something you can monitor, yeah.
I suppose it's a little bit sort of like when you have them at a healthy weight and condition, seeing how much they poo, and then maybe kind of using that as a baseline.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
I have to say, I was counting my horse's poos just out of frustration because he was on box rest and I just couldn't believe the volume that was coming out. And he's a healthy weight, but he does 26 poos a day. That's ridiculous.
Wow.
And now in future, when I buy a horse, I'm going to check how many poos it does before I buy.
Do you keep a poo diary as well? Sort of consistency, amount.
Yeah. Definitely.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Claire. This has really been great.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome.
And hopefully we can have you on again in the future, because I think it'll be really great, and especially live, getting people sort of asking their questions. I think we've managed to answer most of them, but if there are any outstanding, if it's okay to maybe send you through a few and hopefully get your input on them.
Yeah, thank
you.
you.
Absolutely, that'd be fine. No, you're welcome. It's my pleasure, and I'm more than happy to come along and answer a few more. I love questions, and the great thing is that you're able to then give the information that owners need rather than just telling them what you think they need. So it's great to have the questions, and thank you ever so much for inviting me along, and thank you all for your great questions. It's lovely that you're all thinking about this so much. It really is.
We're getting loads of thank yous from everyone. I think they really enjoyed it.
Oh, well, thank you. All right, well, we'll leave you to it, but good night, everyone. And yeah, feel free to leave us comments or feedback or whatever on the Facebook page, and definitely ideas for future ones. So yeah, next week we're hoping to talk about weight management strategies, and we've got some guest speakers coming on for that, which we will confirm. So yeah, I hope to see you all soon, and thank you again to Claire, and have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you all of you. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.